Hello, and thank you all for having me. Unfortunately, due to responsibilities here in The Hague, I could not join you in lovely Sydney, but the virtues of technology bring us together, even in this slightly unconventional way. Now, the history of a nation is always connected to the legacy of its ancestors. This legacy is attached to pieces of cultural heritage that survive at any given point in time, which constitutes the present. In today's internationalized world, cosmopolitanism ideals command that these pieces of cultural heritage also constitute parts of the heritage of all mankind. Though both sides of the cultural heritage coin are invaluable, they also oftentimes come to be in conflict, especially when a piece of cultural heritage originating from one nation finds itself at the disposal of another, without the former's clear consent. This presentation is concerned with what arguably constitutes the perennial such claim, the claim of Greece, addressed to the British Museum for the return of a collection of marble sculptures from the Parthenon and the Acropolis of Athens that are at its disposal. I will try and give you a very brief historical context, though I'm very sure that most of you are well versed on this. The Ottoman Turks conquered Greece in 1453 and ruled in the space until the Greek War of Independence and subsequent emancipation of Greece in 1828. Between 1801 and 1812, Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin, who served as the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, removed parts of the Parthenon marble sculptures and shipped them to England. Now, Elgin sought permission by the Ottoman Empire at the time where the Ottomans were in very good terms with the British, which he received in the form of quote unquote a firman, a royal decree designed to grant permission to perform the acts prescribed to the beneficiary. Upon arrival in England, Elgin stored the marbles until he was successful in persuading the British government in 1816 to purchase them on behalf of the British Museum for the price of £35,000. Ever since, the marbles have been displayed at the British Museum in a special room catered to host them. My presentation today is going to touch upon the following issues. I will briefly go through the arguments that tend to be raised by both the Greek and the British sides. Due to time restrictions, I have chosen not to analyze the legal arguments that both sides have in their disposal. However, I do ask from you to listen to today's presentation, bearing in mind that both Greece and the British Museum have strong legal arguments to make favoring their side of the dispute. And I ask you to believe me in saying this, because I'm Greek, and I seem to be cutting the British quite some slack in my paper. So I'm either going crazy or I'm actually trying to keep the balance. Naturally, transferring a 60-page paper into a 15-minute talk is impossible. With this in mind, I argue that when the legal arguments of a case are close to equal weight on both parties, the best route to be undertaken is that of a negotiation. Then I go on to establish what model I think locates what strategy Greece has been missing in order to finally achieve the successful result it has been seeking for years without neglecting the interests of the British Museum or the interests of cultural cosmopolitanism. After Greece gained its independence in 1828, multiple requests for the return of the marbles have been filed by the Greek government. The British government has since retained a fairly consistent position, having declined all requests for the full return of the marbles. The British have continually provided the same four arguments favoring the retention of the marbles by the British Museum. First, they sustained that Elgin's title was good under international law applicable at the time. Second, the presence of the marbles in the British Museum over the course of time has protected them from the potential damage that could have been inflicted on them by being exposed to the open-air conditions of the Acropolis rock. Third, the British sustained that the marbles have become an integral part of British cultural heritage, not only due to their presence there for more than a century, but considering the effect that they have had on British art through the neoclassical movement. Finally, they assert that a potential return of the marbles to Greece could set a dangerous precedent that may unravel into a ripple effect for a likely universal removal of world museums' acquisitions from the so-called source countries. On the other hand, Greece has been advocating for the return of the marbles to Athens on four principal counter-arguments. First, the Greeks maintain that the monument to which the marbles belong, the Parthenon, is situated in Athens, and by extension, the marbles ought to be in proximity to the monument they were built to embellish. Secondly, they make an emotional plea for the marbles forming part of an inseparable monument, which to this day stands as the cradle of Greek past and present, and is deeply embedded to what constitutes the Greek identity. Third, the British are under an obligation not only to Greece, but to mankind to unify and restore the Parthenon. Finally, and fourth, perhaps most practically too, a potential restitution of the marbles in Athens would allow for their exhibit in close proximity to the site of the Parthenon in a state-of-the-art museum built especially for this purpose, the Acropolis Museum. Over the past 2 decades, the number of incidents involving the return of cultural artifacts to source nations from museums, governments, and individual collectors has increased internationally. In the past years, Greece has been actively pursuing the return of cultural objects attached to the Parthenon under emotional appeals and through setting a quid pro quo strategy. It has succeeded in securing 3 returns, one from the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, one from the University of Heidelberg, and a couple of voluntary returns by individuals who have inherited looted pieces of the Parthenon. Though successful in part, this strategy has not succeeded in convincing the arguably most important player in this narrative, the British Museum, to take the possibility of the marbles' return seriously. The question then is, what further methods could the Greek government employ in order to convince the British Museum that a return of the marbles would be in their shared interest? Short and long-term loans seem to be a common option in procuring successful returns of cultural artifacts. When transfer of either title is undesirable or impossible due to legal caveats, parties tend to be more comfortable with agreeing to loan the object whose return is requested. In particular, instructive is the example of a style of negotiation that was pursued by Italy towards the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The agreement concluded between Italy and the Metropolitan Museum involved the return of several cultural artifacts, the most notorious among them being the Euphronius crater. While most legal scholars had contended in advance that Italy's return claim was legally weak, negotiations led to an unexpected agreement with the Metropolitan Museum. This bilateral agreement has 4 important elements that could be instructive for a Greek strategy. First, the transfer of ownership of the artifacts to Italy was established. Second, there was a liability waiver on behalf of the Metropolitan Museum. Third, there was an establishment of a cooperative framework between the parties on the basis of a series of exchanges and loans. And fourth, they agreed on the promotion of research and education through exclusive excavations and education of museum personnel. The negotiation strategy that is reflected in the agreement between Italy and the Metropolitan Museum presents a unique case for examination of possible analogies to be drawn in drafting a new strategy for Greece. What is conspicuous in this particular agreement is that it is not narrowed to a one-shot coordination tactic, but by establishing repeated games, allows for relationship building potential that far outweighs the bargaining leverage of the individual quid pro quo strategies that Greece has pursued so far. I argue that, aside from the legal and moral arguments, that have been brought on the table for decades by Greece, the key ingredient missing so far that could start up a constructive negotiation between Greece and the British Museum is to establish concrete examples as to how the return of the marbles would benefit, apart from obviously Greece, both the British Museum as well as the international art community as a whole. The bilateral agreement of Italy and the Metropolitan Museum of Art is instructive in highlighting the importance associated with true forms of cultural internationalism, public access, education, international cooperation, and cultural exchange. This is a critical set of criteria for a current and relevant return strategy that Greece has not yet fully embraced and addressed. The nature of the bilateral agreement was successful by virtue of collectively meeting 5 crucial points. First, the art in question was important to the Metropolitan Museum. Second, the Metropolitan Museum did not want to enter a lengthy litigation. Third, Italy is an art-rich nation whose cultural property is of high demand in the international art world. Fourth, Italy is capable of preserving the objects if returned. And fifth, Italy had some form of evidence pointing to the illegality of the original acquisition by the museum. A negotiation model based on this bilateral agreement for the marbles would therefore include the following components: the opportunity by Greece to present its case on why it considers the acquisition of the marbles bore elements of illegality. As pointed out, both sides may advance strong legal arguments. Legal claims, however, should be advanced not as threatening leverage, but as an indication of what could be avoided through the engagement in a negotiation instead of lengthy legal proceedings of dubious outcome for either party. Upon reaching the negotiation table, what is necessary is a systematization of the process under a negotiation model that will facilitate solutions and transpire walls originally built by the parties. The most successful and powerful negotiation model that I had the pleasure of working with during my time at the University of Pennsylvania Wharton Business School is Professor Stuart Diamond's 4-quadrant negotiation model. This model is goal-oriented, based on strategies involving the acknowledgement that people are essential to the negotiation, favoring credibility, trust, standards, and an incremental outlook. When it comes to issues of public concern, the model suggests the following questions in evaluating the quality of a negotiation that are critical to its success. How effective is the communication between the parties? Do the parties understand and consider each other's perceptions? Is the attitude one of collaboration? Do the parties blame each other for the past or value each other for the future? Are the respective needs of each party uncovered and traded? Is the action incremental, or do parties try to do everything at once? Are the parties taking actions that meet their goals? How high is the emotional level? Do the parties try to be dispassionate? Do the parties use another standards in reaching a decision? A quick glimpse at this set of questions describes essentially everything that has arguably gone wrong in the negotiation between Greece and the British Museum over the marbles. Instead of reflecting on the past, however, I will briefly try to unravel the 4th-quadrant model in hope of facilitating a shift in the old negotiation strategies. The analysis that you hopefully see on the board, if our coordination game is working, is by no means of authoritative leverage. On the contrary, I utilize pieces of argumentation that have been brought up within scholarship, public official statements, press releases, and anecdotal experience. Though the 4-quadrant model delves a lot into the practicalities of the actual negotiation, it showcases the important aspects a negotiation on the marble should focus on. Framing the right vision under a balanced cultural nationalism and cultural internationalism appreciation, combined with incremental steps in procuring results, transparency, in order to address faulty perceptions of the past, the appropriate influence of third parties, and an appreciation of unequally valued interests in order to establish an exchange environment are critical to a successful negotiation. Ideas such as loan agreements, trading and exchanging of cultural artifacts, touring collections, exclusive excavation agreements, joint trusteeship, fractional ownership, personnel education, liability waivers, all provide excellent starting points to a discussion not on how Greece can get the marbles back, but on how to form a constructive partnership between Greece and the British Museum that will favor both parties and help them grow. Naturally, the status quo favors the retention of the marbles and has the advantage of inertia on its side. However, the proposed partnership is a deal that is very hard to refuse on the part of the British Museum. It has the potential of successfully promoting ideals the British Museum has stood by for years: collaboration, international exchange of cultural heritage, public access, education, and most of all, the appreciation of invaluable pieces of the cultural heritage the Greeks created, a cultural heritage that is now shared by the entire world. Thank you very much for having me, and I wish you all a great and fruitful continuation of the conference.